Welcome to ETSU's Department of Psychiatry's Grand Rounds. Dr. Freeman will be presenting today. His educational experience, he went to undergraduate at Harvard University, also did his graduate at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine in Nashville, Tennessee, did his internship at University of Florida, Gainesville, and then residency at Johns Hopkins University for psychiatry, was also a chief resident in psychiatry there. Dr. Freeman started out as the professor and vice chairman, Department of Psychiatry, University of Alabama School of Medicine from 1977 to 1990. Was also the dean, Louisiana State University Health Center. Also professor and chairman, Department of Psychiatry at Louisiana State University Health Science Center from 1991 to 2003. Was professor and chairman for the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Tennessee from 2004 to 2005. Is now the clinical professor of psychiatry at Tulane University from 2005 to present. He has written over 100 papers, a book, and done over 100 different clinical trials on psychiatric topics. And he's here to lecture us today.
Thank you very, very much for that lovely introduction. And I am delighted to be here, which I've only been in this part of the state a few times, but every time it gets more beautiful, and it's just very exciting to be back in Tennessee. I feel this second to Alabama, this is my state. So I'm very pleased and very comfortable about it. Now, this is the speaker and part consultant for these three companies. Over the years, I've done most of the companies, and in having done that many, I've been forced to be fair and truthful and honest. And I like that. That's good. And I feel that the drug companies have been blasted over-enthusiastically. It's one of our great industries. Like any industry, it needs to be monitored. We need to be commenting. We need to be criticizing them. They do a lot of good things, and they do some things that are bad. But I'm pleased to have worked with them for about 30 years. That's my new title. I get to, how about a life where you can live in your native city and get to Tulane several times a year? I mean, that New Orleans, enjoy it. And, so things are really, really nice at this point. What I want to do in the next few minutes, and I encourage any of you to speak out in the middle. You don't have to wait till the end, because I'm going to be talking about some very controversial things. I don't like DSM-5. Some aspects of the process I liked, but very few of the results. I'm sure many of you agree with me, probably for different reasons. But we don't want to spend a lot of time in regrets and disappointment. The thing to do is to use our brains to figure out how the next edition can be more useful to us. And I think I have some ideas. You may not like them, but I want to hear your ideas, because we really have this as the foundation, or at least our presentation to the public is the DSM. And it's one of the most widely known and used books in the world, so we need to keep it as quality oriented as we can. Now, the philosophy of psychiatric diagnosis under the DSM is operationalism. Does any one of you want to tell me what that fancy philosophical word is? I've struggled with it for years. Somebody's raising their hand. I saw it right back. All right, I'll tell you about it. Operationalism is itself a philosophy. And the fact is that the DSM creators wanted to be atheoretical, aphilosophical. They don't want any part of philosophies like operationalism. Operationalism is a mechanical, bureaucratic, rigid system of taking a body of knowledge and having set pragmatic rules for how the elements of that body cohere, and how when you make a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, you are confined to about 9 symptom choices. 5 of 9 have to be chosen. Not 3 of 9, not 7 of 9, but 5. And who chooses these arbitrary 9 to begin with? And that you do it in, as I say, a very tight methodology. And I'm going to show you, or at least give you an idea of what I think some of the results of that are. As a teacher for about 45 years, I have not found the DSM sequence to be particularly useful. I've found it to be terrible. I found that too many students and residents feel that this is psychiatry. This terrible blue book I have that I hold in my hands represents the entirety of my field. The truth about my field. The elements of it are so beautiful to read. It is music to my ears and a sight to behold. Don't fall in love, and let's don't get hateful about it. It can be fixed. When you try to teach students from the DSM, which a lot of teachers around the country do, you limit their focus. You limit their sense of the history of psychiatry, of the depths of psychiatry, of the great psychiatrists who have had their own theories. And there are many, many theories, and the DSM-5 tries to be apolitical or aphilosophical. I don't know about their politics. But at any rate, what I would say is there are a lot of philosophic ways you could use. You could use psychoanalytic, which DSM-1 and DSM-2 had. Then you could move to the operational, which is DSM-3, DSM-4, DSM-5, attempts to improve, but all they've done is added more diagnoses, more complexity, more bureaucracy to the situation, in my opinion. A good resident, in finishing a program, I submit to you, knows the DSM, of course, but she knows so much about the historical psychiatrists who've contributed, the best ideas now that are going on in a number of areas, a number of philosophical areas, including that of biological philosophy, psychoanalytic concepts put together. It could be called a philosophy. Cognitivism, on which cognitive psychotherapy is based. Existentialism, other philosophic foundations. And I have always wanted my residents at all the schools that I've taught at to have a wide and deep appreciation of what the field is. Many have and many have not, because you can get through residency knowing the DSM particularly and what you have been instructed in by the detail men from the pharmaceutical companies. So that's what I would call a dreadful program, and mercifully we don't have many of those in the U.S. Okay, let's get to this reliability business. What is it? Somebody want to tell me what reliability is? What's a reliable person? Absolutely. And if you can count on a diagnosis at least being accepted again and again, over and over, you have done the fundamental business of diagnosis. So that's foundational. That's important. And you want to be able to count on a diagnosis like you would a person, that it's going to be replicable, that your ideas will hopefully be agreed with by your colleagues, by your teachers, by your attendings, by everybody who you respect. And so the fundamental goal they've had, the APA has had, is getting reliability established. And I must say, that component of what they've done has been good. They've worked hard on reliability. It's called here, reliability is found in the psychiatric interview after consistency. You can count on it. Consistency of diagnosis is learned among clinicians. Also, with consistent questionnaires, you can go into it more deeply. Reliability will be improved. Both raters and instruments must show reliability over time and context. The training of clinical raters must be nearly identical so that the same diagnoses are reached by all. Now, I'll come back to this in a minute, but I know that residents are not sheep. I was not a sheep. I didn't like some of the diagnoses in DSM-2 and DSM-3, but I would get in trouble if I made any really negative comments about them, how poorly they were constructed. But I did it anyway, and I got in trouble, and I don't regret any of that. You've got to go with your own brain, your own thoughts, your own feeling, your own state of mind when you see a patient and you're supposed to relay to the attending or a piece of paper what you think. Do it your way. What's validity? Anybody want to tell me what validity is? You've heard the word all your life. It's part of the core of an educational process. Our philosophers of education stress validity. What is it? It's okay if you're wrong. Quote, there is no wrong. It's your personal sense of what validity might be. What's that? I think that's a good start. It would be, if something's not pretty valid, why would you bring it to the test in a clinical situation? I think that's good. What else? There we go. We're getting really into it now. Of course, we've got to figure out what correct means and what accurate means. And do you want to follow that up a little bit? Say a little bit more about those two very highly relevant words. Yes. That's a good summation. It's very quick. Let's see what is in the textbooks. What is validity in psychiatric diagnosis? Validity occurs when the inference taken from the assessment is scientifically well-founded, occurs in the appropriate context, is empirically related to external criteria, and is in agreement with other assessments and evaluations. It agrees with the theoretical understanding construct. So, there's context. There is, are you looking where you should be looking at the correct aspects of a patient's problem that it brings to you? Criterion, or the criteria, diagnostic criteria, you've got them laid out in the DSM, are the criteria suitable for this patient, or are they way off? I mean, there's certain things you shouldn't be talking about if you're just seeing a major depressive episode patient. You should not be talking about delusions and hallucinations. You'll then have another diagnosis. So it's got to be within that realm, within that context that occurs and that is empirically related to external criteria and is in agreement with other assessments and evaluations. Like having another colleague come see the patient. Like having the patient take a paper and pencil test. and it agrees with the theoretical understanding or construct. So there are context, criterion, and construct validations, and precise context validity must correlate with lab tests, future course, family studies, and construct validity. Now, what decade does that material come from? This is one of the best groups in the country for decades and decades and decades. It's Robbins and Guzet from the 70s. They're trying to make psychiatry as scientific as biology, chemistry, physics. And it's a struggle. But there's been a lot of help given the psychiatry field by psychologists who are adept and adroit at figuring out how things should be measured. Here there are these precise criteria for what is valid. And yet, this remains from the early 70s as probably the best definition of validity. We just haven't been doing a lot of work on validity. We need to do a lot more on it, or we don't have a field. So reliability could be summed up three ways. Internal consistency, that's internal coherence. Inter-rater reliability, which you can do in research protocols, or again, I'm a great believer in having a friend come and consult with me about difficult patients, and we'll see how close we are together. Retest reliability, and that will be intertemporal consistency. Now, something like a mood, would you expect it to have intertemporal consistency? No. But other things that would be more permanent in the diagnosis, such as for a severely ill schizophrenic, you'd find a psychotic phenomena continuing consistently. But reliability then is about, it's about these three elements. And what's validity? 4 parts. Content, coverage of what it intends to measure. I've seen several research programs over a long period of time that were speaking about measuring a particular thing in psychiatry, but looking at a pool of patients, a cohort that wouldn't be expected to have much to do with it. So you've got to go where the action is. Criterion-related validity enables prediction of external variables, like we talked about, the lab tests, family data, follow-up data. All of those things, again, go back to the 70s. We need some augmentation of these things. We need to be able to say, in our year, 2016, what makes something a truthful diagnosis? Now, you talk to any philosopher here at this university and others, they'll tell you the most elusive thing they work with is truth. Why do they say that? Make a wild guess. Yes. You're not going to find, even at this date, where the DSM's trying to create solidity of opinion, a subjective agreement on things. We don't have a lot of agreement in our field. And it's a rare psychiatrist that says to me, I'm open to psychoanalytic thought. Of course, I'm a biologist at nature, but I do a lot of phenomenology. Who wants to tell me what phenomenology is? It's a method of psychiatry, and it is very philosophically oriented. But what does it do? It takes a person, let's say, who has schizophrenia, who has some very early symptoms of prodromal schizophrenia, the psychiatrist sits down with the patient and not only elicits the psychopathology, but also listens to how the patient reacts to, feels about her psychopathology. Is this a change in her world or the world? Or is she being treated in an evil manner? What's going on in her head about the schizophrenia? Does she really believe she has an illness? Does she know I'm a doctor? Does she know I'm there to help her rather than bring demons back to her? So phenomenology is one of those philosophies all over Europe, barely anywhere in the U.S., although we've contributed to it some, that says, I'm going to treat the whole patient, what she thinks about what I'm doing and we're doing, as well as what I think about it, what her subjective reaction to the knowledge that she's got a serious illness means to her, and how she's going to handle it, how she's going to go forward. Now, that is an example of a philosophy that would like to have some of its ideas incorporated in DSM-5. Not likely. Not a big enough group supporting it. Okay, you see criterion-related validity, construct validation, retest reliability, intertemporal consistency. Now, what is a construct? It's not a construction company. What is a construct? Construct is a thought. It's a positive thought that doesn't have an enormous amount of evidence to support it. But psychiatry is based on constructs. And constructs, with the help of our mathematical friends, we try to measure. We try to see if our concepts have any place in mathematical science, because that can help their validity, that can help their appreciation by the public. I want to get back to this one thing about the schizotypal personality. What does this mean? Should be associated with magical thinking, social anxiety, rather than depression and compulsiveness. Why is it being said this way? What are some pieces of the clinical puzzle that the schizotypal personality presents to us? Well, it's surely not depression and compulsiveness. We're not in the same ballpark if that's what we're talking about. We're off in our constructs. And the constructs are those that through the years, magical thinking, social anxiety, are among the several that have many decades of reliability, and some people actually thinking there may be some validity there. What does this sentence mean? It means to me that reliability is important. You can't do any science without reliability. It's a necessary, however, but not sufficient condition for validity. Why is that last part true? Not a sufficient condition for validity of your diagnosis. A lot of your diagnoses may be false. Why is that? A lot of them. Many of them. Because we may not have, first of all, may not have adequate reliability in them, but that we don't have that element called truth value. Now, true or false on this? Although an unreliable diagnostic interview cannot be valid, it is possible that an invalid diagnosis could be reliable. Why is that? It's very important. This is the basis of your science. Theorize what? You can have a room full of 100 people, and you show a patient a little vignette about that patient, and the patient may have bipolar illness, and you might get everybody agreeing that she's borderline. You might get everybody in the room agreeing she's borderline. Does that make it valid? I mean, you can get a great teacher who's got unusual thoughts about a particular diagnostic entity and fool the public, which is us, into thinking that he's onto something. And he may be onto nothing except what? His own idiosyncratic thinking and his persuasive linguistic charms, that he gets a group of teachers with him, and soon we got a lot of reliability but no validity. Now, we've touched on this, but why would I be talking about this rather than giving you the latest on schizophrenia? Why is this, these concepts, these constructs, necessary to the training of psychiatrists? It's your field. You want to know its foundations. You want to know that they're helpful, that they're not deceiving, that they're not incomplete, that they're headed in the right direction. If you don't want to know that, you're operating in a fog. You're operating only on what the DSM has told you, only what one teacher, not everybody, has told you. You're not operating with the full scope of reading and all these different interpretations of what psychiatry is and could be. And you may be being taught, I know not here at ETSU, but at other universities you could be being taught wrong. Ever think about that? You could go to a school, there's several of them in the U.S., where you have a residency, and I won't name any names, but they stick to one philosophy only. Even 2016, there are still residencies in this country that are purely psychoanalytic, psychodynamic. Psychodynamic psychotherapy being the only therapy that's taught, and the constructs are all Freudian or Jungian constructs. Would you be getting the truth at such a place? Heck no. Not a bit. I would ask you, is the amount of attention paid to either of these concepts imbalanced? And I mean reliability or validity being the concepts. Do we spend too much time on one or value one too much, or what do you think? Reliability, as I've said, is really a fundamental thing, but we are way out of balance. We've spent all our time thinking about reliability rather than the truth. Why do we do that? Why don't we spend more on getting validity, getting the truth? What's the reason? Well, for one thing, the government doesn't have the money to supply all the research that we need to get done. Secondly, the type of research that's done in pharmacologic companies is interesting. It leads to some new, very usable drugs on a regular basis. But does it have anything to do with truth? A little bit. But that's not the main goal. What's the main goal of pharmaceutical companies? To make money. To make money. And if that has to do with validity in psychiatry, I've got some property in Africa that I want to sell you. It's imbalanced, yes. Too much on reliability and not enough on validity. Can we prevent our current quest for reliability from overwhelming our need for as much validity as we can achieve in diagnosis? Can we prevent this quest for reliability? No. It's how the APA makes its DSM money. Selling these books, selling these workbooks, selling all the associated material that goes with it. They don't want to get into validity. Validity is not their field. It's reliability. And their arguments are the field is not advanced enough, not ready yet for a lot of validity talk. Well, the answer to them is it better get ready, because you're not going to have a science that's called a science until you do the studies, think a lot about what the studies mean, and have a true scientific basis for your field. Without validity, you're in a very premature, precarious state as to what you can really offer as certainty. See all these different philosophic things that I've talked about. Can we have our trainees learn about psychiatric diagnosis from all these perspectives? We can if we want to. Very few programs want to. I mean, I was very pharmacologically oriented when I was the chairman, and I had all of my students and residents rotate through our psychopharm research center for at least a bit of their time. I did not bring any phenomenologists from Paris to help discuss how much more relevant that is. I gently excluded, and I look back with regret on this, psychoanalysts from the departments that I ran and the school that I ran. I thought existential was kind of more religious or some subjective vacation you were taking rather than real. I mean, real in a literary sense, real in a daily willing sense, but was it really psychiatry? I didn't have any existential analysts in my departments. Cognitive I did, because we had psychologists who really did the only psychotherapy that has been recognized as having a good scientific base. None of the other philosophies. I regret that, because what I should have been doing is hiring people in all these areas who could say, okay, I know that the idea here is biological and pragmatic for treatment and not fundamental biology, because you're not a basic science department. But I want to learn about all the fields. And I say a 10-year program for American Psychiatry chairmen is to bring as much of this to bear in whatever other areas, in addition to the descriptive psychiatry model we use, the pragmatic, the type of reasoning behind the DSM-4 and 5. That's great, but it's just not enough, is what I'm saying. And you don't have to go with one zeitgeist. You can have many stars leading you. Different types of psychotherapy, different approaches to pharmacotherapy. You know how little literature there is on the use of two atypical antipsychotics together. Precious little. One or two studies. There's a lot to be done in our field, folks. A lot to be done. Well, why shouldn't we use dimensional information as well as our categories for diagnosis? Dimensional is very precise. It says that a person does not have one category of illness unless you go to the government. The RC-Doc criteria are all biological. All biological. And dimensional information is hard to attain. It takes time. it could confuse us, it could wear us out in terms of the paperwork required. So we do the easy thing. We say that these categories are there for us to use in DSM-5 for our work. What is a category? Anybody want to tell me what a category is? It's what? Yes. Is a category an appropriate word to use for a psychiatric diagnosis? I mean, you've got the same questioning about it I do. Why do you have your questioning?
Well, for one thing, many diagnoses have to be provisional and are not serial assessments.
And we ought to acknowledge that fact. And it would give us what? A little more humility, a little more tentativeness, a little more, frankly, uncertainty when we talk to patients, when we talk to students, that we have this data out here, and we don't have that. Dimensional will come into play. Many of our psychologists, our colleagues, really want to use it. It would say, this diagnosis is about 52% of the explanation of the behavior you're talking about. This other one is about 28%. And there are a few others in there. Or this personality disorder is not just antisocial. There's a lot of other elements to it. Borderline, somebody who's, a lot of different things will be given percentages of what the diagnosis is. And that would be so time utilizing, we couldn't get through our day's work if we had to calculate mentions. And how much truth value would it have? Not much right now. We're not even to the reliability stage. But I'm saying we will get there, we will be more accurate when we do work along that line. We have diagnoses now that are practical, valid, that help communication among many parties. Well, some people at APA are proud of their achievement. They feel like sitting on their laurels. I repeat, is that enough? Absolutely not. The DSM-5 is in shambles among Europeans, Asians, many parts of the world, many parts of the United States. It's not respected. Okay, let's get to work. Let's take the partially valid in that diagnosis. Let's make it getting more and more valid. Communication is great. We don't want to do away with communication. America is a practical country, so we're not going to throw these out. We're just going to say, that's not enough for a science. That's not enough for us to spend so much money on DSM-5, so much money on residencies, unless we get the foundation more powerful. How close to full and valid diagnoses are our operational, pragmatic, and atheoretical diagnoses? Can you operate forever without a theory of what you're doing? Do you have to go by somebody else's criteria for what makes for an anxiety disorder? Do you have to be told by the APA what this is all about? No. I suggest that any psychiatrist above the age of about 35 has got her own way of looking at the world. There are two sets of data, the things she has to write down for the insurance companies, the things she has to write down for a variety of other administrative interests, lawyers, unfortunately, all kinds of folks. And then in her own head, she knows what she believes valid about her patients. And I trust a far more individualistic approach in the future. We've come about as far as we can with this operational, pragmatic, and atheoretical diagnoses. People like William James, who developed pragmatism in this country, were great people because they were working in areas like religion, They were working in areas like, quote, political science, extremely vague, uncertain areas of human endeavor. And so I forgive them for the vagueness in the use of pragmatism. I'm saying that psychiatry is past the vagueness point. And no, full and valid diagnoses we don't have. We've got work to do. Do operational diagnoses have truth value? Anybody have any comments on that? They're true insofar as operationalism is true. But operationalism is not about truth. It's about communication. It's about reliability. It's about techniques that make the psychiatrist feel good about her work, make her feel she's doing something that's really understandable and meaningful. No, they don't have much truth value. What is intersubjective uniformity? That's a word that's used in Europe a lot. Well, what it seems to mean to me is that everybody out there, everybody in the field of psychiatry believes the same thing about their field. Or it's sort of like the great philosopher Husserl said, some bits of knowledge in this world are purely in the brains, in the souls of us, and we're all in agreement. It's a communal thing. I don't want anything communal. I want my residents and myself to do my own thinking. Now that's where I get into arguments. This is one of the big places where I get into arguments with people. The answer to me is you have to have rules that you go by, and your individuality as a thinker is quashed. That's what I'm told. Now, a lot of modern psychiatry is biomedical. It's the best funded of these areas, and it has contributed. But it's not complete. Is it adequate for a psychiatric diagnosis? To a certain extent it is, and it's been helpful, but it's not going to give you all the truth that you want about a patient, about his reaction to what sort of a diagnosis he's got. What are his choices? Existential question now at this point. You bring religion into this. Some psychiatrists believe that religion is very close to psychiatry. To do that is to make for a lot of controversy, and I suggest we be careful about that, extremely careful. But biomedical constructs are helpful. It's just that there's more ignorance in biomedicine than any of us are going to agree on. Tremendous ignorance. We think we know some things that we don't. Who was Kraepelin, and what is the neo-Kraepelinian philosophy of psychiatry? And I ask that because I think that underneath this deceptive line that the APA has about, oh, we are non-philosophical in our approach in DSM-5, what did Kraepelin believe? Who wants to tell me? Kraepelin was an early 20th century German psychiatrist, one of the brightest that we've ever had, who felt much like the National Institutes of Mental Health do now, we're going to put our money in biology. He felt, first of all, you had to use descriptive psychiatry and take large pieces of description, carefully noted, and put them together under biological constructs that might include several diagnoses. It's more of a lumping idea, but to get at the biology that's underneath all this DSM stuff. If he were alive today, he would be wailing at the amount of untruth there is in DSM, saying the only truth is in medical science, in biology. That's what makes psychiatry have the potential for validity. All this reliability, it's nice, you got to have it, but it's in the end, it's not that important. Now, What do you think of Kreplin? Is he right? Is he wrong? Is he on the right pathway for us to go? Okay, we've got a supporter of Kreplin. John, please tell us your thoughts. Yes. Oh, he may be the best psychiatrist there ever was. What else would make you feel that you're a Kreplinian? I mean, that right there was incredible. I agree with you. What else did he do for us? Did he have an idea of the non-biological elements of humanity that we have to respond to? Grief, pain, suffering, ideas that couldn't be treated by medications, even now, about people who didn't want to think of themselves as just a biological creature. They wanted to think of themselves as a thinking creature, a feeling creature, not just a set of physiologic findings. I don't think so. So I think of Kreplin as great but incomplete. That's the way I look at him. Has the DSM creation succeeded in the stated goal of increasing inter-rater reliability? Well, when they went from DSM-2 to DSM-3, there was the hue and cry that we had gotten into reliability finally. Nobody much, unless they'd had intensive psychodynamic training, really had the knowledge to make DSM-2 diagnoses. And this is true in the mid-late 50s through the 60s. So they did tests of retest reliability and inter-rater reliability and everything you could think of in reliability. And there was a minimal improvement, very minimal for all the work that went into DSM-3. All the bragging about operationalism is going to solve all our problems, so no. What about between DSM-3 and DSM-4? I don't think you could find, look it up, see if you can find any studies going from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5 about any significant improvement in the reliability. One of the reasons from 4 to 5 not working out is that a whole lot more diagnoses entered DSM-5. A lot more comorbidity was present in DSM-5 and DSM-4 than the previous iterations of this. So the answer to this one in my book is no. Does the elimination of experience and self-awareness, this is phenomenology, from patients with schizophrenia lower the context validity? I'm really interested in whether my schizophrenic patient, as I've said, knows what's going on, can relate to some area shared with me and other help givers about reality, about what life's going to be like, about where they're going to go, what they're going to do, rather than have total confusion, making no sense about what the world's in. I don't know what's happening. Cognitive preservation and ability to discuss these things, terribly important. So I think elimination of experience and self-awareness, I think we should bring that back into the DSM, but it won't happen soon. What way might the old diagnosis, let's take psychopathic disorder. Well, it's now called antisocial disorder. Can it retain its subjective features, which now does not include lack of empathy or callousness? What if you're an antisocial murderer, and unfortunately I've treated a lot of murderers, tells you there's absolutely no regret, no remorse for having killed 6 people? Isn't that important diagnostically? It's not in the DSM, and there's a whole lot more than just this example. Wouldn't it help in your clinical work if you got a report from a psychiatrist to you about a patient being referred, that you knew whether there was empathy or callousness or nothing or something in between? Of course it would help. This is what you're losing in DSM. How important is the increase in comorbidities? It just makes our work harder to write down 6 diagnoses rather than 1 or 2. I'm not for it. Atheoretical, but they're not. They're operational. They're still people who have a full biological persuasion. Many who still, they're old guys, they're 90 years old, but they're still full psychoanalysts. And they believe that being left out has destroyed everything. So they want theory, and it's true that there is a new theory, but the APA won't admit that its theory is there. Should we strive for more inclusiveness and completeness in DSM-6? Of course, but that's a problem. You don't want to do premature research where you think you're going to get validity in a few sets of studies. Strive for it. We're looking at a 30-year project. I hope all of us live 30 or 60 years. Is the large increase in the number of diagnoses a problem for DSM-5? Makes it hard to get inter-rater reliability, which they started out to do as their main goal. If you've got 200 diagnoses, doesn't that make your work harder rather than 50? Sure it does. Could strong reliability be a sufficient condition for validity? Well, we've already been over that. No, the answer is it can't be. Does validity constrain reliability? Yes, that's a very good point. If everything you're doing is struggling to get validity, you will be avoiding the first step, which is to get some agreement in the room about whether this person has bipolar disease or not. Which should clinicians emphasize first? Well, it's reliability. That's where you start. Then you go from there, after you got agreement, into how truthful are our statements about this patient. Can the pursuit of reliability come at a cost to validity? I'm saying it already has, and terrible, at great cost to validity. And we've already talked about reliability not being good with DSM-3, not much better than DSM-2s. And then what was done in the 70s was this whole DSM process to improve reliability and validity. Not enough help from mathematicians and from philosophers in thinking through, and particularly historians who will give you a piece of psychiatry that you didn't know. Why was the term neurosis eliminated? It used to be one of my favorite words. One of the worst things before I studied psychiatry was to call somebody neurotic. And then as I studied psychiatry, I became less eager to do something like that. It's too vague a term. And it covers so many different diagnoses, and it didn't have any clarity. And that's why, but it also had this, it had this stigmatic quality too. Not as bad as schizophrenia, but it did have that. I'm glad it was taken away. One thing that DSM-2 did well, they had a couple of paragraphs at the beginning of giving criteria and ideas about it and all that would summarize in 2 paragraphs the disorder. For the beginning student, that was great. I wish we had that back, maybe in another booklet, but have it back. We've gone over the philosophies behind the recent DSMs, but they're not very powerful, and they need to be implemented more, in my opinion, to get a wider range of knowledge. Now, they could be in other volumes. I don't want a DSM like this. I want separate volumes that teachers can use to teach what they think has some usefulness and possible validity for their students. Very hard question. It helped psychiatry see, physics did, that there was science. There was a way to do it. There was a way to get at it. And then along comes modern quantum theory, and all of a sudden, physics is like psychiatry. The rules are clear. Why can there be one person in two places at the same time? What are we going to do to get it back to Newtonian mechanical ideas that we can all understand and predictable, and nothing's predictable now in physics? Yes, physics is having problems, and I'm glad. It makes us look better. What did later editions of DSM do to help clinicians? Sorry, can't say much. Why do we not have in DSM an accurate, oh, this is going to be good for you. See who can answer this. Why do we not have in DSM an accurate statement of what constitutes a mental disorder? What is mental illness? Does anybody in the room know? We got two senior teachers. Do you all know what mental illness is? I've heard, 1,000 different explanations. But what is wrong with explanations? People are too confident about it. There's not much humility. There's emphasis on what they know, and what they don't know is pushed to the side. They get too philosophical or down in the muck. They don't get a reasoned level about what it constitutes. What is in mental disorder. For example, just one example. Take all the damage that brain injury can cause. You could name a bunch of different disorders that arise. Are these all neurologic, or are some of them psychiatric? I suggest to you that most of them can be called psychiatric as well as neurologic. And often we leave out the neurologic or the other parts of the body that can create a psychiatric disorder. And I think I think we have not figured this out philosophically. And I hate it when a smart medical student gets me on that point. Oh, I get facile as I can with words, but do I really know? Why is it that none of us know? We don't know what the words mean. Mental disorder. A lot of what I see is normal people coming into my office that are under some stress at that time. Or they come in with another problem, a legal problem. Or they come in with a history of depression, but something quite different now because of the external variables. Are the external variables the cause or the basis of the mental illness? Or is it something biological within the person that does it? Should pharmaceutical companies take a drug that's old but keep looking for new uses for it? Maybe, but it's backwards. Why shouldn't clinicians find new diagnoses, then test them before getting into the treatment of them? So I have mixed feelings about that one. Are mental disorders discrete entities, or are they categories of biomedical disorders? They're not discrete entities in the first place. They overlap so much. Are they categories of biomedical disorders? The United States government thinks so. Many, if not most, psychiatrists think so. But does that make it true? Does the inclusion of additional criteria for DSM change interrelated reliability? Yes, it does. Should we include defense mechanisms and pathological forms of subjectivity in the DSM? Probably yes. Because it's so useful to clinicians. In the 6th edition, we do it. Why are British psychiatrists much less likely to diagnose schizophrenia, and more than Americans to diagnose hysterical personality? Why would they do that? Why would there be such difference? Why isn't there world psychiatry rather than all of these differences geographically? Culture, persistence of habit, fixation of ideas. A lot of reasons, and we need to explore that more. DSM cannot serve in every country. This is terrible. Why is DSM less about truth and more about creating a common language? Now, I'm always answered by, you've got to start with the common language. Okay, but do you have to stay with it all your life? Can you get into truth a little bit? Are categorical diagnoses more helpful? Not necessarily, but dimensional is just too hard to do all the time. To get all these, Should operationalism be removed? No. It's been helpful for what it does. It helps us with reliability. Is it accurate to call DSM criteria as partial, indirect, and contingent specifications, which I do? I think I'm correct. I don't know that I'm correct. But I know one thing, they're not perfect. I think the better word might be incomplete. Yeah, and I have partial there. They're on the way, but let's don't rejoice in what we have in the DSM. And we got a minute for questions. Did I cover all of? No, I didn't. I see something.
I'm going to make one statement about the idea of the removal of neurosis from in the context of trying to maintain an atheoretical perspective in DSM. The difficulty is if you conceive of it as a core conflict followed by paradoxical behavior instead of goal-directed behavior, it's a fairly simple way to explain what it is, but it's an extremely powerful psychological device that operates throughout the nature of psychodynamics in both pathology and health.
And particularly anxiety, wouldn't you say?
Particularly in anxiety. And the thing is, I think when we give up that dynamic position, we lose our capacity to leverage psychotherapeutically mutative change in behavior. And that has been a huge problem with DSM, leading to the fact that many of our psychiatrists' colleagues are basically doing med checks and writing scripts.
I agree with you.
That's what they're doing. They're not really pursuing, and as a philosopher, I'm sure you'll appreciate it, they're not really pursuing the good life for the patient.
Yes.
And that's the thing we should be pursuing.
Listen carefully. You just had a senior teacher give you an example that's so pragmatic, that's so powerful. Don't throw out every element of psychodynamics. Keep the good ones, and there are plenty of good ones. Keep them in the next iteration, but also try to keep the number of diagnoses down. We've got to lump a little more. They split all the time. Great point. Anybody else?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
So what you've been talking about is the history of my career. I started my training before DSM-3. I was involved in some of the published early debates about DSM-3, and I've watched how all of this has evolved. And I want to make a couple of comments, I think, kind of consistent with what John said. The first goes to your point that about definition of mental disorder. There's also no definition of mental health in the DSM.
Right.
And I think the reason that both are absent is because fundamentally those are not scientific questions. They are value-based questions, and they're heavily cultural. Mental disorder or mental health starts with the question of what do we value? And then from there we go to how our values affect what is distressing or what is regarded as dysfunctional. And because those things vary from place to place, I don't think you're ever going to get a universal definition, except perhaps with some outlier kind of conditions that everybody agrees are problems. Second thing that I think is important is kind of external to the DSM, but it's how the DSM has evolved within our own culture. In 1980, when DSM-3 was published, there were two things that did not exist in our society that subsequently, in my opinion, made a huge difference. The first is we weren't computerized. That meant that we weren't able to worship the diagnostic number. We still had medical records that contained narratives and case formulations. That disappeared when we started to computerize things. The second thing that happened, which really took force in the middle 80s and accelerated after that, was managed care, which emphasized the statistical phrase of the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Managed care wasn't really interested in case formulation, in a deep understanding of patients. They wanted the simplest and fastest way to dispose of the management and cost of psychiatric care.
Yes.
So they focused on numbers, and they focused on simple things that they could train nurse case managers to harass doctors about in telephone reviews. This in turn gave rise to a mode of professional practice in which the tail wagged the dog. Instead of a mode of practice in which diagnosis was the product of a deep understanding of the patient that took time to achieve, diagnosis now became something that, because you had these operational criteria, could be done in 45 minutes or an hour. And that became a de facto standard of care, driven not by the profession, but by outside forces. That, in turn, filters through all of our training programs and our research programs and everything else. So we're now to a point where we assume that everything you need to know to understand a patient can be achieved in an hour or maybe two. You're expected to do that for all kinds of administrative purposes. And it, in my opinion, it eviscerates the notion of a deep understanding of patients and makes the activity of case formulation feel pointless if what you're trying to do is get your work done.
I thank you very much, because you have taken your career and mine and framed them in only a few minutes of statement of the crimes that have gone on. I mean that, and the but it's not to say woe is all. It's to fight against this wherever you can, whenever you can. I remember as a resident, I had to write about 20 pages on each new patient. I couldn't do that in a half an hour, or an hour, or an hour and a half. It took tremendous time to get that done. And I think it's helped me now when I'm only writing half a page. But that's terrific. I thank you for having me again, and hope to see you sometime.